All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Faculty Grant Seeking Dialogue. It happens to be the final scheduled event for the WiSys 2021 Spark Symposium virtual series. I'm Deborah Lundin, manager of WiSys Research Development Services. For those of you who are not familiar with WiSys, we are a nonprofit supporting organization of the UW system. At WiSys, we support research, we protect and market ideas, and we help to inspire students. And as well, we build culture, all with the goal of inspiring Wisconsin innovation. So my goal for today is to jumpstart a dialogue about the pursuit of external funding, to listen as others share their grant-seeking experiences, to get some questions answered, and to gain perspectives and strategies. Today's attendees hail from a diversity of fields and disciplines, as well as grant-seeking experience. Some of you maybe haven't pursued external funding before and would like to learn more about how to get started. Others of you may have tried and been turned down for funding and want to learn about maybe trying again or resubmitting. Or perhaps you've been successful with your pilot or seed funding and are looking to secure larger, longer-term funding to support your work. For today's dialogue, I've invited 4 faculty members from a variety of fields, disciplines, and UW campuses who have achieved funding awards from many different sponsors. Ahead of the event, I shared with the panelists a list of question prompts on a host of topics, such as how they got started, maybe why they got started, why they pursued funding, their strategies for success, rebounding from a rejection, among a host of other topics. But these questions are really just to get the ball rolling. This event is set up as a Zoom meeting so as to maximize the opportunity for you all to interact with the panelists. In the spirit of this being a meeting, I encourage you to remain on camera or turn on your cameras for this event. And I invite you to unmute and pose your questions if you feel comfortable doing so. If you prefer, you're welcome to submit your questions through the Zoom chat feature, and I will share them with the panelists for their responses. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started this afternoon and meet the panelists we have for today. Let's go ahead and start with Liz Glogowski. She's Associate Professor at Eau Claire. Liz?
Thank you. So yes, my name is Liz, and I'm in the Department of Material Science and Biomedical Engineering here at UW Eau Claire. My background is in polymer chemistry and polymer science. And so a lot of my grants throughout my 10 years here at UW Eau Claire have been with that in mind, right? So I started with American Chemical Society, Petroleum Research Fund funding, NSF funding through RUI, and that's research for undergraduate institutions, and MRI, which is major research instrumentation, both through NSF. And then at the state level, both Weiss is funding for applied research, such as an applied research grant, and I have an active Regent Scholar Award, which provides funding for the summer as well. Oh, and Deborah asked us to talk about if we've ever reviewed. And yes, once I received NSF funding, they started asking to be a reviewer. So we're not supposed to talk about which panels we've been on, but I've been a panel reviewer and an ad hoc reviewer for different directorates and in different levels. And so can provide that perspective as well. And then ad hoc reviewing for other agencies as well.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Dr. Michael Hammer is an associate professor at UW Whitewater. Michael?
Yeah, so good afternoon. Thanks for sharing the afternoon together. We've got lots of things we want to accomplish with the remaining summer, and we're focused on grants. So congratulations to everybody who's here to focus on this. My background is kind of strange, a little bit in music, speech language pathology, and then upper airway neuroscience, specifically how the brain controls the mechanisms for breathing and voicing and swallowing and so forth. And in terms of grant focus or research focus, I tend to focus on healthy mechanisms and also Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders that can affect these neuromuscular systems. And in terms of grant funding, my attempts at funding started during my PhD program with a couple of small local or foundational grants. And then my first taste of NIH funding was motivated by the impending birth of my daughter, as my wife at that time was pregnant, and I was very motivated to get my first NIH grant as a doctoral student. And I got the funding, which was fantastic. So NIH career development funding brought me to Wisconsin to start with. And then I've had smaller R03, and now I have an R01 grant from the NIH, which is currently in a no cost extension. And so I'm actually working on a couple new proposals now to get out the door within the next month or so. In terms of grant review, I've been on several review panels for the National Institutes of Health, a couple of other foundations here in the States, and the Parkinson's Disease Foundation of the UK. So look forward to talking or helping others too. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Dr. Andrei Ivanov is Associate Professor of History at UW-Platteville. Andrei?
I gotta unmute myself first. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. This is so wonderful to be here. I have background, as you could see from my last name, in Eastern European and Russian history. So my subspecialty is imperial history, so pre-Soviet period in the history of Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And I have received a number of grants in my last career years. On the federal level, NEH. So you heard about NSF and NIH. There's another one called NEH, and Department of State Title VIII grant. This was last year. There are a number of other foundation grants that I have received. Josephine de Carmen Foundation. University of Notre Dame has an Institute for Advanced Study. So you may have heard about the Institute for Advanced Study concept. So this was probably the highlight of my sort of research experience, because it was a residential fellowship / grant. And it was very collaborative and interdisciplinary. I was living literally, it was residential. We had apartments where we were living. So I was put into a collaboration team with a quantum physicist, an MIT mathematician, a University of Michigan hospital director, and a Dominican friar, and me, and we had to collaborate and innovate together, living at the Institute for Advanced Study in Notre Dame. So that was quite an experience in interdisciplinary collaboration. Statewide UW system grants, mostly with OPID, WTFS program, and the IRH in program, the Institute for Research in the Humanities. They provide excellent grants and support to faculty in the humanities throughout the UW system. So that's the statewide. And I have been a reviewer for very, very limited number of grants. One is a German European Center for Cultural History in Wolfenbüttel. I've reviewed grants for them. And then for Carnegie Foundation, Carnegie Trust's research incentive grants, I've reviewed for them. So that's kind of the summary of Presi of my experience. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Andre. I appreciate that. I'd love to hear more about that highly interdisciplinary program that you're in. So we also have Dr. Jamie Schneider. She's with UW River Falls as professor of chemistry. Jamie?
All right, well, hi, everyone. So my specialty area is actually in chemistry education research, and so I'm a discipline-based education researcher. So I'm in the Department of Chemistry. My training is chemistry, but my training is also in educational research related to chemistry learning. And so most of my grants are related to that, or related to possibly retention or other programming related to student learning, student outcomes. I've been around for a little while now. I've been getting grants since the early 2000s, if that gives you an idea how long I've been around. But I've kind of, along the NSF lines, for educational research through the Department of Undergraduate Education, they've slowly been evolving their grants. I had a CCLI back in the early 2000s for an NMR instrument. Those have since gone away. I had a TUS grant to start a larger research project, and that since has gone away, and it's now evolved into IUs. which is improving undergraduate STEM education. And I now have a type 2 ICE. I had the 2 was to explore, and the type 2 is a multi-institution grant now that I PI with. We have 5 different institutions, and we had a industry collaborator as well for a while. The other projects that I've been on throughout my history, I had a NASA grant for a while for education in K-6, well, technically pre-service elementary teachers. And then I've had a variety of internal grants through the various schools that I've been at, either in their system, in the school, etc. I'm also, in addition to my role as a professor, I'm our WISCamp Scholars Director on campus. I'm the PI on our Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation Grant through the UW system. I'm the sub-award of the larger UW system grant. And we also had a rather large STEP grant, which is for retention of students in STEM on campus. And so that grant just ended right before the pandemic, thank goodness. So, because that's just shy of $1 million, and it's well, it ended up being almost 7 years by the time we got everything recorded. So, but those are some of my grant experiences. I think that was the gist of what we were kind of describing. So, pretty active in terms of reviewing. I have mostly reviewed for NSF, but I have been called upon by other programs as well. I've been reviewing for NSF, you know, as Elizabeth pointed out, you can't really say which program, but I can say in educational programs, mostly DOE programs, but it's been a variety over the years. For a while, I was one of their, I forget what they called it. It was like an ad hoc reviewer, or it was their review college they had for a little while, something they were trying where they had someone on call. So they would, basically a program officer would reach out to me with a proposal that they had a hard time finding someone to finish the panel off with. So I might get an ad hoc proposal here or there. So throughout the year, I would get those calls. So, but those are some of the experiences that I've had over the years.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I think the one of the questions that's on my list that's definitely going to be asked by myself will be, you know, to talk to me or to talk to us about the value of what being a reviewer actually helps you as a writer in terms of how you approach the proposal development process, understanding what the review side, you know, looks like on the backside of everything. But again, I'll reiterate that if you'd like to come on camera and unmute and ask questions during this time, please consider doing so. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and kind of get started with our first question for today. And Michael kind of touched upon this in his introduction, but when were you first introduced to grant seeking? I know Michael talked about it, kind of sounds like maybe in his doctoral days or maybe postdoctoral days, but anybody earlier than that, maybe graduate school, possibly undergraduate school, and maybe where you learned how to write one? Anybody want to share that one, Liz?
Yeah, I actually wrote one as an undergrad. I mean, you know, it's probably like 2 pages or something, right? One of these summer undergraduate research proposals. That was where I got my first taste for it. I had no idea what I was doing, but the important thing, you know, was that I did it, and I was working with my grad student mentor, and he helped a lot, right? And just thinking about how to craft a proposal and what needs to go in it, and thinking about the audience that wasn't me, right? How to convince somebody else that this was cool and should be funded. And so it was kind of low stakes, right? And so it was a good first step. And then, yeah, just helping my research mentors along the way, both in grad school and postdoc, to get more of a taste for it, but really coming here and jumping in with both feet, like I had to try it and see what happened.
Great, thanks, Liz. Andre?
So for me, when I went to graduate school is the first time I've heard about the grants and the grant writing. And our first 6 years of graduate school were fully funded with exception of summers. We had, I think, summer stipend for 1 or 2 summers and so on, and for the rest of summers we had to seek our own funding. So that's the first time I got introduced to it, is that I started applying for funds for a summer activity. However, most of my summer activity was still granted through my graduate school because I found these foundations in graduate school that could cover it. But then my last year of graduate school, I ran out of the funding from institution, and so my whole year I had to worry about the upcoming year. And so this is when I first applied to nationwide grants and federal grants and so on. And that is when I got my first nationwide funding. It was in my last year of graduate school, the finishing dissertation sort of year. So it was the dissertation, completion grant actually that I got that was most important at that time. But and then after graduate school, yes, it became a kind of a reality for my research and scholarship going forward. Just you always are on the lookout, and you always are in the pipeline of applying for one or a grant or another that that you need to keep your project moving. So,
Jamie, did you have some thoughts?
So I was fortunate that I did some summer RUs as an undergraduate, and between my senior year and what may have been my first year of grad school, except I had 1 quarter left of undergrad, I applied for an NSF graduate fellowship. And then because I ended up taking that extra quarter, I applied again for a different NSF graduate fellowship the year after. And so I had those, I was able to basically spin those RUs into sort of those graduate fellowship applications because it was the same institution I was looking at. So that was some of the ways that I got involved. Might not be something we often think about with some of our students doing those RUs, but if they are connecting to the same graduate school, there might be that possibility. And then just from there, conferences constantly, if a program officer had a poster session or a talk, I tried to put that as one of my sessions that I would attend just to kind of hear what the buzz was going on.
And so when you're referring to RUs, we're talking about the National Science Foundation's research experiences for undergraduates.
Correct. Sorry, I forget. We have a lot. Yes. Research experiences for undergraduates. And so I was at the University of Minnesota for a research experience, and I thought, hey, maybe I'll work with this person. And so that person helped me write a graduate fellowship application or grant.
So you had some supports, with your faculty advisors who helped with the writing process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wonderful. Anybody else want to answer the question? Michael, would this be something you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, so I was in the dissertation phase, or right on the crux of it, similar to Andre, and where I went to for my PhD, there was actually 2 or 3 of us that were interested in writing this, what's called an F31 predoctoral fellowship. And so there was some camaraderie and some encouragement. We had different areas of focus, so we could collaborate and kind of help each other read our specific aims, read our proposals, and kind of push each other to improve. And so that was, I think, part of what I'm grateful for, is that culture of, hey, let's at least learn through the experience, if not succeed in getting funding. So that was really, really a helpful fertile ground to incubate our first successes.
Did anybody take any kind of writing course about grantsmanship, or you just tried it? You just struck out and wrote?
Yeah, I'll jump in. The NIH has these regional grant writing seminars, usually quarterly or maybe 3 times a year. And so I wrote a small proposal on campus to be able to go to one of these early on. And then on campus, because it was an R1 institution, there were several experienced faculty that volunteered to provide kind of a seminar to give us some guidance in terms of best practices for grant writing. So that was super helpful.
Jamie?
So I did attend a career writing workshop, so Council on Undergraduate Research Writing Workshop. I know that WiSys has been kind of supporting some attendance to that. That was really helpful. That was part of, I believe, what helped fund my last larger grant. That was a lot more tricky to write. And then, just really as NSF has webinars, if I thought it was something that was interesting, I generally tried to hit them up and listen and kind of hear, what they were looking for. And so some of that was, I guess, a lot of the training that came along was through those webinars.
Great, thanks, Jamie. What has driven your interest in pursuing grant-funded work? Anybody want to talk about that? I know being at a predominantly undergraduate institution, you guys have a lot of teaching responsibilities. But so like, what kind of catalyzes you to keep going through this process? Anybody can unmic and go for it.
I mean, I guess I can say that quite honestly, when I first started writing grants, it was a little bit the realism that if I didn't get reassignment for my classes, that carrying my research projects would be challenging. And so part of it was for some support. And then also in the summers, I had little kids. And so it was either pay the institution to watch my kids so I could do my research or try to get some funding. So there's sort of that realistic side. And then the altruistic side is, I think when you're writing, you really have to define your project. You really have to think about where it fits in, who you work with. And so your project just becomes that much more rich. So it's kind of a combination of those two.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I can add to that. So at least in my department, it's an expectation to apply for external funding. With the, let's go with dramatic change in funding rates over the years, it's not an expectation to get funding, but at least to apply for it and try for it. And I agree with what Jamie said, like, even when a proposal doesn't get funded, it's such a valuable experience to go through the thought process of writing down my ideas, in a concrete fashion and getting the reviews back, even if they're not what I want to hear, right? It is a helpful process for my research. And so beyond just it being an expectation, I want to be able to do research with undergrads, and it's a very rewarding part of my career. And so to be able to afford to pay students during the summer, right? Because in engineering, they could go off and get an internship and make more than twice as much as what I pay them. And so I have to be able to offer them something. And then, yeah, my own summer salary too. Just, it's nice to be recognized for the effort that I'm putting into it, and being able to dedicate that summer time to research and not having to teach is helpful for the external motivation, in addition to just the joy of working with students and being able to do my research.
And I'll jump in too, because I think part of the process of grant writing is, the end goal. I want money so I can do this, that, and the other. And the thing that maybe helps, maybe encouraging to everybody along the way that may be at different stages, is just the act of sitting down and shutting things off and thinking about your ideas and writing things is valuable time in and of itself. So for example, I wrote an R01 it's 12 pages of science plus lots of other pages that go into it. But I think I had maybe 80 pages of pre-writing and just thinking through the details and facets of things that maybe like more than I could accomplish in a grant proposal, but it gives you a chance to kind of really spend that valuable time thinking and maybe coming up with better ideas than if you just aimed for the money. So I think it's important to realize those long-term goals of getting the money and funding students, which I certainly am motivated by, but also just the chance to spend some time with your own scholarship and ideas and creativity is really time well spent. And so, for example, like the last couple of weeks, I've really been focused in on a specific NIH grant deadline. And then I thought in the midst of spending that time thinking about it, I came up with some new ideas that it makes more sense maybe to wait a little bit and let some of these ideas mature, pull in some new colleagues and collaborators, pull in a little bit more preliminary data from some other things to make it a better idea. And maybe it's more fundable in the way that I can present it just by spending time thinking. And so the best advice maybe one of my mentors gave me is just give yourself time to think and consider and ponder and enjoy, whether it's the arts or, basic science or biomedical research, whatever the area is, just spending time with a craft that you enjoy is part of that process too. That's easy to forget, I think.
Yeah, I definitely advocate for developing your ideas before you start shopping around for the funding for it. I think once you find a funding opportunity, you're more driven to figuring out how you can make the deadline than making sure that your ideas are fully formulated. I have a question, kind of circling back around to, I asked you all if you guys had been on review panels, and sounds like at some level everybody has been on those. And if you can talk about the professional development aspect of reviewing proposals and how that has informed your writing as well.
I mean, the one thing that it informed me is just how exhausting it is to be a reviewer. So if you have to review 10 to 15 proposals, you have a week or two, but you're teaching and doing whatever else. When you're reviewing the proposals have to catch your eye. You have to get a feel for what's going on so quickly because, again, you're having to do so much of it that if it doesn't really pull you in and really and get you thinking about the project and agreeing that this project is worthy quickly, I'm having a hard time getting to page 7 with any sort of real depth. So that's the best advice I can get, because sometimes when people write papers, we spend all this time on introductions, but a grant is all about marketing and selling. And so you have to get that reviewer just excited and ready to go and know exactly why it's here. That's something I really picked up on as a reviewer. I see other heads.
I think for me, it was one of the important things for grant reviewing that I've done or that I've been told to do is to be very careful with eligibility criteria. That is, I have to look to see if the applicant is eligible and fits the criteria. And some, I would say that in my case, I would get very detailed directions as to what is eligibility and what are the criteria. And so when I'm reading, it could get really tedious, as you mentioned earlier, that reading these applications and trying to figure out, okay, does this fit into this criteria, does this, okay, and so on. But it helped me in my future applications to try to read those criteria, eligibility criteria, very carefully, much more carefully, and try to think and rethink about my application statements or my research proposals to see, do I qualify? Is this eligible? Does this fit the criteria of what the agency's funding? Because as a reviewer, I had to do this myself in my own review, is to just try to figure out, okay, is this proposal actually fitting the criteria, and also is the applicant even eligible? Because there are some cases when the applicant wasn't even eligible either by, for example, a degree, or not having a certain degree, or not having a certain other level of education. So, I mean, you have to read through that. You have to be careful with that, but also you learn about these things yourself. And when you're applying, you're trying to put yourself into that position, saying, okay, am I eligible? Is this criteria? Does this criteria fit?
Okay, anybody else? Liz?
Yeah. So what I've learned being a reviewer is that the panels can be pretty diverse in composition, not just in what we normally think about in diversity, but like in background, right? And so it's really important in a proposal that you're not using super specific like subfield jargon, right? Because not everybody is from your subfield. And so that really helps me with writing to remember who my audience is. Even though it's a technical audience, it's still, they have different backgrounds and different expertise. And so like Jamie was saying, you have to really draw them in right away, but that broad audience, right? That broad technical audience, you still have to capture their attention immediately.
And so just a quick point, the panelists, I don't know how many of you reviewed prior to being an applicant or an awardee, but you do not have to have had an awarded proposal in order to serve as a reviewer. And so if you really kind of want to get an understanding of what that review process looks like, even ahead of your own proposal submission, you can submit to agencies your vita and resume and for consideration for being a reviewer. And we always, I advocate for that every time. So I know, Michael, yes, please.
Yeah, I just put a couple of links in the chat menu for everybody. Something Andre mentioned brought this to mind. You can actually look and see what proposals are currently funded by the NIH. You can see what proposals have or have been funded in the history of both the NIH and also the NSF. So I included those links in the chat because sometimes that gets you an idea of not like the mission and the scope of the agency or the directorate within the NSF and so forth. You can kind of get a flavor for how others have formed their ideas, and maybe you can get some alignments. Or if it's an area related to what you're doing, it might be somebody that'd be relevant to reach out to as a collaborator or a mentor as well. So those are some really helpful resources there.
Great, thanks, Michael. Kind of building on the idea of NIH and NSF, because those are federal, and if you've never written proposal before, going federal your first time might seem a little bit daunting, right? And so maybe we could kind of talk about progression of funding. Did anybody not start with federal with their first grants? And how do you think, and what do you think that did in terms of your progression of getting to where you are now? Liz, I know that you, please go ahead, Jamie.
I was going to say, I just think that having been a faculty member at 3 different institutions in my career as tenure track faculty, the more you can offer internal support to establish research programs to get that background data, the stronger those national programs are going to be, in my opinion. And so I can't emphasize enough. I should say my third hat at my institution is I'm a faculty fellow in our grants and research office, but I'm a really big advocate for you. You have to have some form of support to get things started. It's just so important. So whether it's that small internal grant, it's your sub-award, anytime you can get your hands on being just a sub-award or a senior personnel on somebody else's work, just to start your projects and start thinking about getting those experiences, I would really advocate for that, because your proposals in the end are going to be that much stronger. And, as Michael mentioned, you might suddenly find some new collaborators and all of a sudden now you're writing it together. So you just never know. And that kind of happened with me with someone from Milwaukee. I love that I could be I'm the PI on their grant, they're my sub PI on my grant, and I'm just at River Falls.
So
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I didn't jump in right away because I did start with federal funding, but rather than, thinking about like what level of funding I started with, I focused on the new faculty opportunities. So both ACS and NSF try to help new faculty. So NSF through the MRI, the Major Research Instrumentation Program, really prioritizes trying to fund instrumentation for new faculty, and ACS has designated funding for new faculty. So I didn't actually get funded until my third time for both of those. So I had startup funding, because even though for new faculty, they still wanted preliminary results. And so I used my startup funding to order everything and get those first results and use that in both of those. And then they both got funded in the same year and then went from there.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I was going to say, talking about money now, if the university gets an NIH grant, for example, for every $1 So like, at least for our regional campuses, depending on the negotiated rate, every dollar that comes to the Whitewater campus on my RO1, there's an additional 42 cents on every dollar. So for a $2 million grant, that's a lot of money. So the university, for these awards, investing some money actually can have a really big payoff. So asking for a pocket of money, $3,000 to $5,000, let's say, something on the more modest side, to get some preliminary data and actually to put a stamp on your biosketch that says the university's invested in this, that's pretty cheap if they end up getting, half of an NIH grant in addition to the funds itself. So I think having those savvy, just clear conversations about, at a time of fiscal constraint, like what do we get? 9 to 12% of our campus budgets come from the state, maybe. If we can encourage them to support, at least in a small way, bringing more money to campus, there's a lot of logic there at a time when resources are seemingly scarce.
Thanks, Michael. Andre, do you feel like your progression has kind of helped you get the additional awards that you've gotten in the recent years?
Yes, it does build up. It builds on. I started out my last year, dissertation year. I applied for every grant I could apply, the federal ones and the non-federal ones, but I got only non-federal grants for that year. And over the period of time, I've applied also for federal grants and gotten them as well. So I don't know if one sort of leads to another or another leads to, but it's, there also have been years when federal agencies have been constrained. I think years ago, there was some kind of a, what do you call it, a debt ceiling. And when they couldn't pass the budget, and there was some kind of talk about, total freeze and so on various kinds of funding. There were all kinds of, and then there were times when NEH was really underfunded, for example, and then ACLS, funding has been frozen to faculty as it is during the pandemic right now. So there's been, it comes and goes. So. But I have I found that applying for federal funding helps also with applications for non-federal funders like the Mellon Foundation and so on. But at the same time, the funders applying for Mellon Foundation or any other foundations out there, it also helps with applications for federal funding.
Thanks, Andre. I'm going to just quickly build or kind of build out or define kind of something that Jamie referred to earlier in her response, and that is a subaward. So what she's referring to is Milwaukee. It sounds as though they were the lead applicant in a proposal, and Jamie and River Falls was a subaward partner with, no, it's a reverse. Reverse.
That's what I was so excited about. I was the lead. They were my sub-award.
My apologies. So
R1 is my sub-award of my PY.
No, yeah, that's even, no, great. That's even more impressive. So basically, if you were going to be collaborating with another institution, they would be considered, if they're the lead institution, you'd be the sub-award. And if you're the lead, they would be your sub-award. It's a document that helps transmit those program dollars to each other. So, and I think what she's kind of talking about is if you can perform first, maybe as a sub-award to another person's lead application, that can also help kind of catapult you into your own lead applicant, principal investigator status in future projects. So thank you. So I know Andre kind of talked about funding rates, so I'm going to kind of skip over one of my questions and go to the next question. Let's talk about funding rates. So funding rates are typically not on the side of the applicant. We can see funding rates, they can go all over the place. I know NEH can go to being under 10% funding rate for applicants. And the summer stipend program, I think, was around 8 or 9% in recent years. It's of course never fun, to talk about being declined for funding, but does anybody want to talk about an instance where they maybe were declined for funding and maybe what they did to revise, resubmit, and see some success, because, you know, usually revision, depending on the problems with the proposal, usually revision will up your chances for success in the second instance. Anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can jump in. My first R01 was not funded, but I was young enough or early enough in my career that I had what's called new investigator status. I don't know if that's true for the NSF and the NEH, but if you're early in this process, that can be a really nice category to latch onto. So I received the comments. It was October. I was depressed and sad, which give yourself some time to be sad and depressed, like accept that part of it. And then I thought, wow, now I've got all this feedback from these reviewers who are experts in this area. Let's make it better. Because of new investigator status, that enabled me to turn it back in with improvements sooner. And then the next time I got funded. So that was really great. So embrace your inner sadness, give yourself time to grieve, and then embrace the fact that these reviewers have given you some bulleted points that you can improve your proposal with, and then, you know, thank them graciously, accept and use that as an opportunity, kind of like in wrestling or judo, right? Like turn it to your favor, turn those failures to your advantage.
Yeah, Jamie.
So I can kind of talk about two scenarios. So one scenario, I was the collaborator on somebody else's project. It was going to be a collaborative NSF. And we were turned on the first time and the reviews were not so good. And we tried a second time and the reviews actually got worse. And one of the things that we realized is that our two projects just weren't meshing in the reviewers' eyes. And so the lead PI decided she was going to take the project in a different direction. And I was like, yep, that's fine. And so we severed ties and I went in a different direction. She went in her direction. And then quite interestingly, the same thing happened to me on my project. So I submitted a grant where I was the lead, and one of my co-PIs, her sub-project just wasn't reviewing well. And so I had the conversation with her that maybe if that's the direction she wants to go, she can go, but I think it's not going to work with our larger project. And so I went in a different direction and then I was successful. And so I think sometimes, you know, looking at one of the things that really helped me was I realized when the reviewers are pointing out a hole is I went to a meeting, had a poster session and talked to anybody that came to my poster session and look for that expertise to fill in that hole. So be creative about, we're at little institutions. I think sometimes finding those collaborators and bringing them together, because they might be at a little institution themselves looking to do their own little niche. So that's kind of how I built my team this last time, was through a poster session at a conference.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
I think, yeah, you didn't finish, did you? Oh, okay. So I had a grant at Harvard that I applied for 8 years in a row, pretty much every year. Applied probably 8 times, maybe more, maybe less, but that's what I remember. That's about as many times I applied for it, and then I got it. So I made the revision every time. I looked carefully at other people's, you know, who won that fellowship for that year, and when I applied, every time I applied, I revised and revised and revised until I think I sort of got it to see that I understand the institutional culture of the funder, that I could deliver my proposal in such a way that it fits what the funder is supporting in terms of their themes, particular, you know, like let's say research theme for this year. With the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, I think that was a 3% funding ratio. Having said that, it is not uncommon at all in the humanities to have funding ratios of 3% or 5% and below 10% for sure. It's not uncommon. I don't know about other disciplines, but it is very, very cutthroat in some ways, you know, very competitive. So knowing
the funding rate, is that small in the humanities. Well, I was going to ask you, for your Harvard effort, I guess what kept you going on that one? And I guess, that's the first question. And what's the solution to the competitiveness of the humanities? Like, how do you try to get yourself above that funding line?
Yeah, so for the Harvard one, I mean, what kept me going was were encouraging letters of that they sent me back, their decision letters. I mean, they were not sort of, in some ways, sometimes, you get decision letter and it's very vague and says, sorry, but, they were very encouraging. And they also gave me a kind of an understanding that my proposal needs some work, and that this is one way to improve, and this is one way to improve, and so another way to improve. And then I also talked to other people who have applied there, and some of them who have gotten and some of them who have not gotten it, and try to get the whole picture of, okay, what's going on here. So yeah, for Harvard, for the Brian Bates Houghton Fellowship, when I applied for it, I applied again and I applied again, and I knew that sometimes it's not actually just because your proposal is bad. It's because they have a very low funding rate and they need to have numbers rejected, and you just need to apply another year and then apply another year and then apply another year. And there is always a lottery element to it, always. Although in my case, I think there wasn't just a lottery element. I needed to improve the proposal and the way I was putting everything together. With regards of humanities funding, so the way to solve it is, of course, to increase the funding. But there's been, on the federal level, for example, there's been kind of a war going on in the Congress, against the NEH on several levels, and against the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, that's saying, oh, we don't need this funding. Oh, this is not, a federal business to fund, history of Vietnam War. We don't need to know anything about it. It's not important. And there's, just a lot of ignorance that's been coming out of Capitol Hill, so to speak. So unfortunately, as long as that continues, the politicization of research and scholarship and inquiry, as long as politicization of inquiry continues, I don't see much hope for increase in funding, but hopefully there will be increase in funding. So I don't know.
No, thanks. Anybody? I'm just going to revisit if you all in the audience have questions that you want to pose to the panelists as we're talking, please feel free to unmute and ask your questions or put them in the chat feature, and I'll pose them to the panelists. Yes, please, Michael.
Yeah, quick point. The other point too, to kind of balance that, right? The funding rates are low. I think the NSF, this might be true. I know the NIH, there's a little bit of latitude. There's really two stages of review with the NIH. There's scientific merit, which I've been involved in. And so that's where they rank, the quality of the science, let's say. And then it goes to a second stage of review a couple months later, where it goes then to council. And that's where funding decisions are made. Scientific reviewers don't make funding decisions at the NIH. That's just the scientific review. Then the funding decisions are made. So for instance, somebody that had a relatively modest or not fantastic score, depending on the priorities of the agency or the institute in particular, they may choose to reach down below the fundable scores and bring something up because of the scientific priority of that agency or of that institute. So that's where that initial conversation with a program officer or a program director or someone with the agency, just to make sure your ideas align, they may be able to see through maybe your imperfect grant writing to find a great idea. I don't think that's the approach to grant writing you want to take in general, but know that, aligning with the priorities of the organization is so important for that reason. Write a good proposal, but also if you're if you match the mission, that's going to be give them an excuse to reach and maybe choose one that might have fallen down the ladder a little bit.
Yes, please, Liz.
I just wanted to add to that. NSF's a little bit different, right? The panels will rank proposals, and then the program manager has to argue, which ones get funded based on the budget. So that's why it is important to understand like what division you're applying to, what they're looking for, because it's the program manager that's making those decisions, and having a conversation with that person can be really helpful. The one thing NSF does for individual investigator awards is they pull out PUIs or RUIs or for NSF. And so if they try to fund a certain percentage of RUIs, so research for undergraduate institutions. So with that designation, that can help if your proposal's on the line. And our budgets tend to be smaller than the big R1s, and so we can like sneak in there. At least that's how it works for individual investigators. Jamie, it sounds like you have more experience with like institution level ones, but yeah, that's how it works.
It's a little bit different with the education grants, but there are definitely, I know from talking with program officers, there definitely is push and pull like you were describing, Elizabeth, in terms of, they have certain priorities and trying to make sure that different institutions are represented, different institution types. And so as I said, I make sure in my field to always attend the sessions by the program officers or to stop by their posters, because I know most of the program officers on the grants that I would apply for right now. And I think that can only help, because when I email them, I can have a more one-on-one conversation. They're still a program officer, but it's just easier because I already know them. I've already had conversations with them. And so anything that you can do to be able to, if those opportunities arise, right? I mean, everyone's areas are different, but if the opportunity happens to arise, definitely take them up on it.
So we've had a couple of questions enter the chat, so we'll go ahead and try to look at those. So the first question is, does anybody have experiences with grants to support international research projects? And are there some unique things that one should think about when they're approaching an international type project?
I can say a few things. I know some people who have applied for Fulbright and who have applied for research Fulbright in particular. That's one thing to consider, is that Fulbright does not just fund, let's say, half a year or a year at a university, teaching at a university abroad. It can also fund a year of research abroad. So if you have, let's say, an international research project that involves, let's say, doing research at several locations or at one location in Japan or in Cambodia or elsewhere, there's Fulbright for that. There's very often a research Fulbright for pretty much for every country in the world, but not, pretty much, but not every country in the world. So that's one thing to look at, is that I've known people who have applied for research Fulbright, and I'd like to apply for one eventually as well at some point. But I've heard great stories about folks who received Fulbright research grants for international or country specific research abroad. Yeah.
Anything to think about, maybe like something about a particular location. I think from my perspective as a former research administrator, I think if you're looking for funding from a domestic sponsor, I think one of the things you have to look at is whether or not, if you need funding for collaborators internationally, you'll have to make sure whether or not the sponsor you pursue allows money to be transmitted to that international partner. Mm-hmm. I think there are instances where there are what I would call sister sponsors in some countries who, can provide the funding for your international partner to kind of collaborate with you while you get funding from your domestic sponsor. But that would be something that you would want to look further into while you're searching for your sponsors. But is anybody else have any thoughts on this particular question? I would just say whatever institution you're with, I would say just go and visit your sponsor programs office, and they can probably help think about all of the or how to navigate through those when you're looking for funding. Another question that's come through is working with private institutions or industry to establish collaborations for funding. Is it treated in the same way as a grant from the NSF or NIH? If you're looking to do funded research within industry, you would probably be establishing a sponsored research agreement with that industry, which would have some terms and conditions similar to an operating agreement with a grant agency. And then they're looking for, is there any good approaches to finding industries who would be willing to support or collaborate within your region? Anybody want to speak to that?
I mean, the closest thing that I had was pulling in an online technology company, but I was offering to pay them through our NSF grant. It wasn't the other way around. And so I know I just had to make sure that I asked lots of different people about drawing up contracts and, making sure that we did everything appropriate that way. I don't have great advice other than make sure you ask the people that know, because there are some funny, and Deborah would know more about this, but there can be some issues with intellectual property. So we had to be very clear about who owned what we were working with them, and make sure, and I still don't know to this day if I got it all in writing in the right way, but we did our best to make it clear about whose intellectual property it was, and or maybe it's patent stuff. I don't know what you're working
on. Yeah, no, thanks, Jamie. Definitely. When I would say ahead of approaching an industry, well, searching for industries, I think you could probably find some different offices on campus that may have established relationships with some industries within your region. You could also consider, reaching out to maybe your regional associate from WiSys within your area, because you may have established relationships with some different types of industries, or maybe could help support some exploration of that. But yeah, so when it comes to the relationship building with the industries, there are some things that you want to keep in mind, making sure that things that you reveal maybe are not proprietary, or if you want to make sure that they remain yours, you may be looking at potentially establishing maybe a non-disclosure agreement with the industries. They too, if they want to talk with you, but they don't want to reveal something from their side, or that they want to keep confidential, those are the kinds of maybe early stage relationships you want, or steps you would want to take. But and we're happy to talk offline more with you, Carlos, to kind of turn you into some onto some good directions for that. So,
and I can add to that a little bit.
Yes, please.
So here at UWC, we have the Material Science and Engineering Center. So at least through that, we interact with more companies. And I would say, like, it's so varied. Each company, does its own thing. It's not like they have published guidelines like the NSF does with rules to follow. And so then it's really more about the relationship and what both sides can bring together. And so it can go everything from just like fee for service, like a student running samples on one of our instruments, right, where we don't need an NDA, to more like a collaboration where they're willing to give some more open-ended funding, and then it matters if it goes through the university or if you're acting more as a contractor. And so it's complicated, and it's just a different kind of complication than like a federal grant or a state level grant. And so yeah, talking to people who have gone through it at your institution is helpful, and because I would guess like each UW institution is a little bit different. Like we have to run our NDAs by system legal and it takes longer and there's just different hoops to jump through.
But yes, there are lots of support mechanisms out there to help you take those steps. Definitely. Thanks, Liz. Michael, I know you had wanted to.
Yeah, just a brief nugget. Some of the people I've collaborated with are physicians or surgeons. And so sometimes you have the ability to walk down the hall with them, get on an elevator, go to another floor, and then they're off. And that's your chance to meet with them and talk with them. So my point is the elevator pitch, right? Have the ability to know your stuff so well that you can succinctly communicate it as if the only time you have is with a surgeon just on the way from point A to B in about a minute or two. So whether it's program officers or industry, all these different questions that are coming up, it makes me think of having that really pithy, quick pitch as WiSys supports for our students. We should be really good at making our quick pitches too, while protecting our intellectual property, of course.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Thank you for sending in your questions. Please continue to do that. Or again, I invite you to unmute and ask for questions. I want to go back to something that Jamie talked about, maybe even Michael talked about as well, and that is talking to program officers on the front end of an effort. So if you have an idea, or I guess, can anybody just speak in general and advocate for talking early and often to program officers from programs that you're looking to submit to? Anybody is willing, ready to jump in. Okay, Michael.
I can go right away. So my very first time talking with a program officer as a doctoral student, I put together what's called a specific aims page, which is probably the most important document that goes into your grant. It's the first thing people read. It may be the only thing people read, but I sent it to them in advance so they could look at it. And they read it and said, oh, well, you need to send your stuff to some other institute. So my lesson learned was I had not written it well enough for them to understand the degree to which my idea fit with their institute. So they said, oh, go send it to some other related institute. And I thought, okay, that's helpful. I need to rewrite this. So you can kind of get some early feedback that might steer you back on course. So that was really important. I always start with a conversation with my program officer, either by email or something, and just go, I want to make sure this aligns with the goals. Even though I've been with the same institute for all of my career, I still go back. My specific aims are sitting in the inbox of my program officer now, just to make sure we're aligned well. So it has no influence on my ability to get funded, but it helps me make sure my program or my ideas match what their programmatic goals are.
Before anybody else jumps in, John and I must have been on the same wavelength here in this chat. So he said, how helpful is contacts or engagements with program officers, and to what extent can one go with them? And then also, if you don't get the minimum response you think you need from them, is that an indication that your idea is out of their consideration?
Oh, I remember sitting in the audience at it was AAC&U, which is the American Association of Colleges and Universities. So there were, it was a huge ballroom with a program officer on stage. And she talked about how many thousands of phone calls and emails she gets a day. And she said, here's my advice. If you don't hear from me, be incredibly polite, but resend me exactly what you just sent and say, I'm following up. I just want to make sure. I know you get a lot of different emails or whatever. And so as long as you're really polite, she said, it happens. And I laugh because I tell my students the same thing. I get 100 emails a day, and half the time, I miss a student email. So I always say 24 to 48 hours, try again. I think she said, give her, a few days. And if you don't hear, try again. So it may not be that they don't like it. They generally respond. They're really, my interactions have always been pretty positive. I'm not saying there isn't a stray person that might be a little bit out there, but give them a chance to respond. And they're not going to tell you if you have a good proposal. That's a pet peeve that I've heard from program officers. Do not ask them if this is good. Don't ask them if this is worthy of funding, because I can't say that. you can ask about fit, like Michael was talking about with the program, or as Andre pointed out, all those different rules that they've set up, you know, send them a page or two or a synopsis of some sort and just say, does this follow the rules? Or if you have a specific question about a role of someone, that's the best advice I can give, is be specific with your questions, but also give them something to start with and work from.
Thanks, Jamie. Now, I know not all sponsors, and we're talking probably more at the non-federal level, have the bandwidth capacity or even personnel to be able to be responsive to inquiries. That's why, with some smaller foundations, they dissuade or disallow communication with them directly. And in such cases, what you find is like a two-step process where you may have to submit like a letter of inquiry or a letter of intent and you kind of give them a quick taste of your proposal. It's kind of one of their first steps. And so that is more of a lower bar in terms of effort, expended. And they'll turn around and they'll tell you whether or not they like your idea enough to be able to write a full proposal. If anybody else wants to weigh in on the whole talking to program officers, but I guess the other question I would ask would be, would you ever consider writing a proposal and submitting it and not talking to a program officer first?
So I can jump in here. So I don't think I've talked to program officers before submitting my proposals, but I also had them all rejected on the first time and then had to resubmit. So maybe that's a sign. But I have talked to the program officers after it was rejected, before I was resubmitting it, to understand the review comments. And the one thing I would say, that conversation was not by email, right? I asked for a phone call because sometimes they're more willing to say things on the phone, right? That's not in writing. Sometimes it's a program officer that's a rotator, so their time's up, so they'll be more blunt. But they can help, like they sit in, at least for NSF, they sit in on the program or the panel reviews, so they can help interpret what the comments meant if they are like super short or not detailed enough. And so, yeah, rather than asking, if I resubmit this, will it get funded this time? They're not going to say that, but it can be like, which aspect of this comment was something I should address, and what was just the personality of that panel this time, which will be a different panel the next time. So if I change everything, the next panel might not like it either. And so the program officer, is there throughout the whole process so they can provide more of a perspective.
Right, thanks. Anybody else want to chime in on program officers and communicating?
Yeah, I'll jump in too again. Sometimes there are meetings where these program officers are present and make themselves intentionally available. So like the NSF shows up at the Society for Neuroscience and many other meetings. And so they'll oftentimes have themselves. So maybe if you can find a meeting that's interesting to you that just happens to be in Chicago, drive down or over, or Minneapolis, wherever you are geographically, because then they're getting their food and lodging paid for the specific purpose of having that conversation with you. And so that might be a good chance to catch them in those moments and have those less formal conversations.
I mean, I advocate for it all the time. I go back to the idea of developing your ideas and getting it down on paper. Maybe even having, colleagues kind of kick the tires on your concept paper, before maybe you send it out to the program officer. But nevertheless, trying to establish a level of fit between your project and the program that you're eyeballing. I think there is an anxiety about somebody being told no, don't submit. I mean, I don't know the program officers actually can say no, unless you're not eligible, no, don't submit. They may say, well, I don't think it's the greatest fit with what our goals are for our program, but this program officer down the hall in a different sub-program or a different division or directorate, I believe that might be a better fit. And so I think the fear of no shouldn't keep you from talking to the program officer. And actually, from the way I advocate for it, I advocate for talking to them so that you aren't spending weeks on end writing a proposal that may never go anywhere because you maybe don't have the fullest understanding of maybe what that program is looking for in proposals and projects.
And I love the concept of no being a pivot point. No, okay, what else? Like maybe there's a different nuance or direction that opens to you too.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Again,
yeah.
Please go ahead.
I should also add that before the pandemic, conferences were very important for that, because a lot of the funding agencies are there. And, just like publishers, right? The academic publishers or commercial publishers, they come there looking for authors. And so if you go to any major conferences, they will be there. The question, of course, if the conference is in Chicago, okay, you can drive there, or Minneapolis, but most likely these conferences are going to be in New York, DC, San Francisco, or LA. So the question is, are you going to invest the resources if you don't have other funding to just go to that conference? And that's a big question. But before the pandemic, conferences were places where you could meet these program officers very easily. Yeah.
So when you go to conferences and you engage with these program officers, do you ever hand them anything, like maybe a concept paper or just a one-page write-up or a paragraph or anything? No? Okay.
You could just tell them. Sometimes they ask you, what are you working on? Because some of these program officers would have like a seminar, let's say Fulbright or NEH. They would have a seminar for scholars, and then after the seminar they talk to you, and sometimes they even have a booth, and they will hand out materials to you at the booth, and you can talk to them and even have conversation and coffee. But usually they don't really like to take anything written from you. It's never really, because they are already overwhelmed with conference of 5,000 scholars and so many things to read already. So it's just usually small talk, but sometimes you can get very helpful advice going to those booths or talking to their at the end of the seminars.
So let's kind of pivot from maybe the writing and submission process, and let's kind of talk about what it's like to run a grant on campus. So I know everything has our benefits and there are challenges, right, to operationalizing something on your campuses. Could you speak to some of the challenges that maybe you have encountered and what you've done to get beyond those challenges or to resolve those issues, and what do you do?
And I guess I can speak a little bit, having worked with R1 institutions and then PUI institutions. They're used to saying, yeah, I'll have my people do that. And I'm used to saying, yeah, I'll figure out how to do that. So there's a big difference there. I think every one of our institutions has more or less people in their grants and research and accounting offices. And so get to know those people, be really nice to those people. They're generally overworked at our institutions. Ask a lot of questions. Don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. Every year I have to ask how to deal with contracts again, because I just don't, when I do it once a year, I don't remember. And inevitably I fill something out wrong and I have to redo it. So just have a thick skin is the best thing I can tell you. Don't piss off the people that you have, because it'll not go very far. Be flexible with your budget. And every granting institution is really different. Some allow, like NSF allows you to spend your money more fluidly up to a point. There's certain limitations. So in other words, just because you said you were going to spend $100,000 in the first year, if you only spent 50, that money just floats. Whereas like Department of Ed is much more stringent. And so know your granting agency, know if there's fluid movement or if you have to ask for exceptions every time. And then with like NSF, be prepared if you have to do exceptions, and you have to write them out and get to know your program officer pretty well. So the best advice I can say is keep that thick skin and play nice, because there's a lot of little pieces that you have to take care of.
So I guess maybe Jamie, to what you were saying, would that then kind of inform possibly how you structure the project on the front end as you're submitting the proposal? Understanding like what's possible on campus, what you can do, what you can't do, and working with your sponsored programs office as early as you can.
Definitely talk to your sponsored program officer. I also, although the subawards are sometimes challenging to manage, the fact that they have their own budget and their school is responsible for their own stuff in the long run is probably better, because every campus has different rules. Every campus has different indirects. Every campus has different fringe. I mean, it's all different. And so if you are planning a budget that has more than one institutional operation, make sure you're not waiting. It took me probably 3 or 4 months to pull our budgets together because of all the different institutional bylaws and rules, and every campus had to have their own signatures. So, it's not a trivial thing to put a budget together and just say, oh, I'll just write it this month and turn it in and it's due. I'm like, no, it's not going to work. So make sure you're planning enough time. But everybody thinks they can leave budget to the end, but you really need to be conscious. Michael knows, you really have to know, like, there's so many little pieces that go into it.
But you're not alone though. Your sponsored research office, has experts there ready to help you. The budgeting process can be a partnership between your sponsored program office and you, and they can help you identify how to calculate some things, right? And so again, it's the refrain of start early. And yes, with probably every institution that you add into your project, you're going to need to add time for that person on that campus to work with their sponsored program office, who will have their own internal deadlines and routing processes and approval processes. Because what you have to understand is that you may be the principal investigator on an application. However, the application is going out under your institution's name. The award is made to the institution. And so the institution has to be aware and on board and approving of what it is that you're submitting. And so start early. Michael, did you want to talk about anything on that front?
Yeah, it's like voting in Chicago early and often, right?
Yes.
Sorry. I mean, we're all from Wisconsin, so we can make fun of Illinois. Sorry. Yeah, the budget, like a lot of times, like I've been in a couple meetings recently with other folks that have ideas, and it's hard to nail down where they're coming from. And so I think that's where sitting down and writing your science ideas, but also sitting down, and it's like we learned hopefully early in life, right? Develop your budget. What do you actually need? Because then you can then go to the agency and go, wow, they only have $5,000. I need more. Or, hey, I only need $3,000. That's perfect. So I think the sciencey piece, spend time thinking about, and as Jamie was getting at too, really, and Deborah just said, really working that budget early. So you know what you actually need, because then you know what you're actually going to ask for.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. I have a couple more questions, but I encourage the audience to send in their questions, or of course unmute and ask your questions. Anybody want to talk about, I guess, in terms of operationalizing your grant on campus when it comes to engaging the student researchers? What's that been like for you and supervising those students?
I'll jump in. It's a real joy, but you also don't have to spend out of your grant. There are maybe campus resources, so the students can get involved by, we have an undergraduate research program called the Research Apprenticeship Program. So the students get paid out of that office, but still work with us. Or maybe they're signing up for an independent study because they're really excited and they want a good letter of support for graduate school. Or you know, if they're really solid, then pay them out of the grant too. So there's some flexibility there. So if you don't have money now, there are still ways to get students involved as well. And I do take advantage of those opportunities because they're there for the students. It's so fun.
Great, thanks, Michael. Anybody else want to talk about undergraduate research within your projects?
And the big thing I can say is be mindful of their time. Like whatever commitment you made with them, know ahead of time that this student is committing to 3 hours a week, or this student is committing to full-time over the summer, or whatever that commitment is. Make sure it's upfront, make sure it's in writing, make sure that you have regular check-ins, because it's they're undergrads. We all know this, best practices, right? What are your expectations? What is the commitment? And then have regular feedback throughout the process. You know, we all get really busy. And so the best thing I could do, I guess one thing I learned over the years was with my research team to set regular meetings as best I can and be flexible. You know, there's times in the middle of the semester where I cancel the meeting, but the meeting is set. And that just, even if we get together for 15 minutes and just, hey, how's life going? Okay, well, it's back on your radar. Let's talk in 2 more weeks. Because otherwise projects, we just get very busy at our institutions. So it's easy to get distracted and not pay attention, especially with undergraduate researchers, I think, because there is an independence.
Yeah, and if I can add, like my greatest joy is finding a freshman who becomes a sophomore, who becomes a junior, who becomes a senior. And eventually they're taking charge of this aspect of the project, or they're recruiting participants and testing them and analyzing data. So I think part of a role that we can play is really mentoring their success, independence, presenting at conferences, being co-authors on papers, or maybe writing their own grant proposals. Kind of like, I don't know if it was Liz or Jamie that said, as an undergrad, I wrote a 2-page proposal. Like that's the next step to, I don't know that we always want to encourage, honestly, people to go into higher education to get PhDs if we're honest about it, because it's so hard. But what a great chance to give them a taste of it so they can decide for themselves, is this a future path for me or not? And that's great too. Not everybody follows in our footsteps, and that's a good thing too. They find their own piece of this in the universe.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, the whole point of what I do for research is to work with undergraduates, right? Like, I'm not the one in the lab making new polymers. They're the ones, I'm training them to do that. And they're the ones actually engaging in it. And so I really thought about how to structure that when I started as a faculty member to be able, you know, because undergrads, it's great when they can start as first years, but they don't always, right? And then they eventually graduate. They can only work full time during the summer. And so being able to pass that knowledge from one student to another, and having systems in place, like Jamie said, to have regular meetings, so we're checking in and making sure things are on track, because, you know, at least the funding agencies that I've worked with, like, are understanding about undergraduates, but they still want to see results in the end, right? And so it's me driving that ship and the students doing the work. And so we all have to work together to make sure we're staying on track.
Thanks, Liz.
I should add that a lot of times this is a once in a lifetime experience for students. What they get from a lot of this undergraduate research sometimes is something that they'll, you know, it will stick with them for the rest of their career, or they will learn new approaches, new methodologies. They will learn and improve further on. But I just give you one example for you know, kind of memorable experience. We had a professor who received a grant to study history of slavery in Wisconsin. And so he took his students to the graveyards of African slaves buried in Wisconsin. And can you imagine the kind of once in a lifetime experience students had working with the graves of African slaves buried in Wisconsin? They were invited to US Congress. They went to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. to present this research. So, you know, it's kind of a, you know, being there in the spotlight and of of US Congress on the one hand, but also putting light in the darkness on this dark page in history of our state. You know, that's another thing, and you are one of the students involved in that. You're one of the, you know, part of the team, you know, one of the 6 or one of the 7 students who were part of this, and that's something that I guess hard to relive again, so it stays with them for the rest of their life, I think. But
thanks, Andre. We did have a question come through the chat. I'm not sure how many have done this on your campuses, but would it be of any value to be on your IRB committees? Have you guys served on the IRBs, and do you have thoughts on that? I guess, Jamie.
I mean, I can just say I haven't been on the IRB committee, but I certainly have interacted a ton with IRB committees. And so I think if your research involves human subjects, getting to know those committees, if it means being part of the committee, it's definitely important, because it ends up being a pretty big endeavor, I think, with these types of projects. Deborah, I was going to say to your last question, we always talk about undergraduates at our institutions, but if you collaborate with others, you can have graduate students on your grants or postdocs. And a lot of times we don't think about postdocs, but postdocs can run a lab of undergraduates that you supervise. And we often forget to think about, does your grant allow the funding of a postdoc? Some do and some don't. But I've seen some pretty successful research teams that are led by postdocs at PUIs. So a lot of liberal arts colleges are using that strategy. And I know I had a lot of graduate students as well from other institutions. So it's just something to think about. But sorry, Michael, you had IRB.
Yeah, I would say there's a similar theme you might see here, right? Early and often, and like viewing the IRB as your friends rather than your enemies, right? Because some of you may have, like, again, you don't have so much time because we're so busy scattered doing so many things, but it just requires time to do it well. And then having those conversations with the IRB. And I don't know about the other campuses, but some campuses have stronger IRBs than others in terms of different things. So maybe it's helpful to cultivate that friendship with the IRB, you know, the person who's the director or who's the compliance officer or whatever. And it's fine to reach out to maybe some collaborating IRBs just to try to help process that. But don't see them as an obstacle, see them as they're there to protect you and the participants and everybody else. So certainly view that as a friendly, it may be frustrating, but view that as an alliance rather than an obstacle.
Great, thanks, Michael. We're at 4:29. I want to throw out one last question, and anybody's willing to take it. And that is, anybody who wants to share maybe an impactful, pivotal aha moment during your grant funded work, that something that reinforces that this is why I do it. Or maybe you guys are still finding one of those.
Briefly, yes. It's that aha moment that happened at 2 o'clock in the morning when I thought, aha, I just connected 2 thoughts that really maybe lead to this new avenue of research. It has nothing to do with the money or the submission. It's the thinking and enjoying the process time. I try not to stay up that late anymore, but for me, that's probably where the joy is.
I have something. We're working on a project right now with the Weiss Center that's supporting transition, families in transition in Rock County. And that's been really, really interesting. And we just collaborated with them on an expansion of that grant that's going to be for 5 years. And we're cross our fingers, hopeful to get it. We'll know very soon. And that's going to make a real difference in Rock County for those families.
Thank you for sharing, Carol. I appreciate that. Anybody else want to share an aha before we depart for the day?
I mean, I have the same aha as Michael, just how often I've started writing and realized, this is where I can go with this project. We kind of talked about it at the very beginning, I guess.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I had a recent alum email me this summer, just like thanking me for the opportunity to do research and how it helped him not just develop the technical skills, but like the presentations I made him do and other things. And like he just really appreciated it and said it's helping him where he is now. And so just hearing that, you know, like it's helping the students get where they want to go is really impactful for me.
Thanks. Thanks to all of you, Andre, Liz, Jamie, Michael. I really appreciate the time that you spent with us this afternoon, and everybody who's in the audience. Again, thank you for sticking with us throughout this whole conversation. I don't want to have the conversations here. I guess in the audience today, if you guys are if you're looking for getting into grants, please start with your sponsored programs office. They definitely are there to help you. If you're looking for funding, check out the Pivot funding database. Every campus in the UW system subscribes to it, and you can find almost every imaginable sponsor out there, non-federal, federal, they're all out there. And there are on-demand webinars on the WiSys website to be able to maybe learn more about how to get engaged with that database. And then I'll just put in a plug. We're going to be launching our grants webinar series again for this next fall. We'll start in early October, and I'm actually going to be doing another starter webinar on how to use the Pivot funding database. But information will be coming out in the next several weeks. But again, thanks to everybody who joined us today. And like I said, reach out with questions, reach out, for connections. And if there's other questions that you want to answer, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help. So thank you to everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Right. Thank you.